Well, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensies. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today, I have another special guest with me, Dr. Tremper Longman III. He's a biblical scholar specializing in Old Testament, and he's written extensively on wisdom literature, including the book of Proverbs, which is one of my favorites. I try to read at least a book of Proverbs every day. My dad taught me that as a kid. Me and my brother continually do that, and it's been awesome. God's been blessing it. So I'm really excited to have Dr. Longman on because I've read his works on this. I've a bunch of his books, oldie but a goodie, God is a Warrior. I recommend that to all of my listeners. But another impetus for having him coming on to talk about Proverbs is that Jordan Peterson is back. Thank the Lord, he's still alive. He's feeling more healthy. But he's talked about doing another in his installment of biblical series where he talks about the psychological significance of the Bible. And he said he's going to start on his Exodus, but in the meantime, he'll start doing some Proverbs because they're easier to do. So I thought we could preempt him a little bit, and I could bring on one of my favorite scholars and kind of give us the outline and some understanding of the book of Proverbs before Jordan Peterson does. So without further ado, Dr. Longman, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Hey, thank you, Parker. Great to be with you.
Yeah, so we talked about a little bit about the impetus here, but can you give us an overview? What is the wisdom tradition in the Bible, wisdom literature?
Yeah, Parker, that's a great question, and one that's actually somewhat disputed these days. I just finished writing a chapter for the future Cambridge Companion to Wisdom in the Bible on this precise question. And so I'll give you my answer, and then I'll tell you what the issue is.
Okay.
So I do think we can identify certain books as related in terms of their genre and call that genre wisdom literature. And those three books are Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. Now, some scholars think that these books are so unique that they don't have much connection with the rest of the Bible. And I would disagree with that.
Yeah.
And others who disagree with it have taken the tact of challenging whether there is such a thing as wisdom literature or even a wisdom tradition.
Yeah.
And most notably, a guy named Will Kine, a good friend of mine, a very excellent scholar, wrote a book called An Obituary for Wisdom Literature.
Wow.
Which is, that gets your attention, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I think his main issue is, as I say, one I agree with, that there is a tendency of people to identify Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes as a genre of literature and then think it's kind of, as one scholar called it, though he used a German term because he was a German, an alien presence within the Bible. I don't think it's that, though I do think that these three books, Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes, are all related by having as their central feature an aspect of the concept of wisdom.
Yeah.
Proverbs basically announces that in the first 7 verses, that this is going to be a book about wisdom. Ecclesiastes, I think, is really a wise man talking to his son about another wise man who is called Kohelet, or the teacher. And then Job is really a wisdom debate. And just one more point, and then I'll
please
stop. But and that is, I also think Will Kine is right that, and he's right about the nature of genre, that books don't have just one genre. So you got to be a little bit careful. If you just focus on, say, Job as wisdom literature, you might not see the connection with lament literature. So a book can have more than one genre.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And actually, your take on Ecclesiastes that I found in this one, the fear of the Lord is wisdom, just blew my mind and opened up the whole book. I think you're right. I haven't read a ton kind of debating that, but so far I'm convinced, and it's been really helpful for me to see, a father talking to his son and saying, here's this philosophy that we're going to consider. And then at the end, he says, all things been considered, fear God and keep his commandments. And it makes so much sense of what's going on. But so sometimes people will talk about wisdom literature as a genre that transcends just the biblical phenomena and actually goes into the Near Eastern religions and other people around. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd say that that's true of every type of biblical literature. I mean, we have Babylonian Psalms, we have Egyptian love poetry, we have, not much, but we have some, say, peripheral Babylonian prophecy, and we could go on and on. So God chooses to write, to inspire his writers to utilize literary types that were common to the people. He didn't create whole new genres. So we have something very similar in terms of form to Proverbs in a whole bunch of Egyptian instruction texts. We have Babylonian texts that bear interesting similarities to the book of Job. And I got into Ecclesiastes because I wrote my dissertation on Akkadian fictional autobiographies, which bear Akkadians, the language of the Babylonians and Assyrians. And these writings bear a formal similarity to Kohelet's writing in 1:12 to 12:7 in the book of Ecclesiastes. So that reminds us that God is speaking to through the authors to their contemporary audiences. John Walton puts it very memorably when he says, the Bible was not written to us, it was written for us, but not to us. So God used the language Hebrew, which he didn't create a brand new language, and Hebrew is related linguistically to other Semitic languages, and so he uses similar genres as well. And what's interesting, and this is kind of a distinctive quality of wisdom, is that that even within the Bible, we see appreciation for ancient Near Eastern wisdom. So in 1 Kings 4, when the narrator says King Solomon was even wiser than the Egyptian wise men, the assumption there is that the Egyptian wise men are really wise.
It wouldn't be a good point otherwise.
It wouldn't be a good point otherwise. You'd never hear something about, Jeremiah was even a better prophet than the prophet of Baal. I mean,
that's a great point. Yeah. Wow. So you mentioned that you did your dissertation on this, and that kind of led into Ecclesiastes. But how did you get involved in what is wisdom literature, just at all, in particular, in particular with Proverbs, but just in general? What made you go that route?
Well, that's interesting. To me at least, it's as a young student of the Bible, and as I say, I did my dissertation and at Yale University, and I wanted to do a dissertation on poetics, or how ancient Babylonian poetry worked, and compared it to the Bible. But my advisor, W.W. Hallow, said, no, I want you to work on these texts, these Akkadian texts, which I then had to translate and analyze. And it turned out that a number of them, as I say, were in an autobiographical form, just like the preacher, the teacher is, the teacher was king. So it bears a formal similarity. So and then I compared it in my dissertation to Ecclesiastes, and then Old Testament professor of the last generation, R.K. Harrison, who was the editor of the Nikot series of Erdman's, he wrote me and said, I hear you're interested in Ecclesiastes. How would you like to do a commentary on Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs? So I wrote the Nikot commentary in the mid-90s, and then I just became fascinated by wisdom. And, eventually I was asked to do commentaries on Proverbs and a commentary on Job. And so just kept working away at that material, which is fascinating.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating, and we're all really grateful for it. So I'm glad that God kept you on that track. Putting you on the spot here, do you have a favorite proverb?
Oh gosh, I don't have a sort of a favorite. I mean, some I find particularly interesting.
Yeah,
like one that says, "A loud greeting in the morning will be treated as a curse." I mean, it's kind of like, and it's a reminder of how important timing is in wisdom. Proverbs aren't always true. Proverbs are, or to put it more positively, Proverbs are always true when they're applied in the right situation. But if they're not applied in the right situation, then you're misusing them. I'm actually writing an article about that now for a journal called Word and World.
So, that's perfect. That one, my dad taught my brothers, and my sister and I to read Proverbs all the time, to pray every day for wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. And so my dad used to always wake us up, hello, good morning, children, and try to, like, because we would sleep in and stuff. And finally, my oldest brother, he was upset by this, and he said, he quotes this proverb to him and says, "Dad, a greeting in the morning, that's wrong. You taught me to do that." And so my dad stopped doing that because my brother
that's good.
Proverbs on him. Yeah.
Well, here the son taught the father something, right?
Yeah. My favorite kind of depends on where I'm at, but right now, Proverbs 23:23, buy truth and do not sell it, buy wisdom, instruction, and understanding. And I quote this anytime I need a new book. And my wife is kind of skeptical, hey, Proverbs says to buy wisdom, don't sell it either. Don't sell my books.
Yeah. Good.
So in seminary, that's been a helpful one for me.
Right, for sure.
So you talk about, I came up with just an outline for our talk here, and I pulled from your another one of your books that you co-edited, and a survey of Old Testament. It is an introduction to the Old Testament. And that's you and Raymond Dillard. And so you talk about in that the chapter on Proverbs, you talk about being a different type of book. You acknowledge that there's little explicit talk about God, and no reference to the great acts of redemption or to the covenant. But that while this book is practical advice, it's practical, but it's given in the context of fearing the Lord. Can you explain how this fits in with the rest of the Bible?
Sure. Yeah. And I probably, today would state that somewhat differently, but it is true that the book of Proverbs, as you read through, particularly Proverbs 10 to 31, has a lot of what we might call practical advice, kind of like, lazy hands are soon poor, hard workers get rich kind of advice that don't seem particularly theological. It's very similar to what we might call emotional intelligence, that is practical wisdom, learning how to say the right thing at the right time, do the right thing at the right time, feel the right emotion. But it's wrong to think of Proverbs as a kind of secular or non-religious book, not only because there are a number of Proverbs that do mention Yahweh, but because we need to remember that in the very beginning, at the so-called preface, which is Proverbs 1 through 7, it culminates by saying, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." And that phrase, "the fear of the Lord," as the beginning of either wisdom or knowledge, occurs a whole bunch of times in Proverbs. And so that's a way of saying, you don't even get started being wise unless you have the right relationship with God.
Yeah.
So it's not like you build up to that. That's where you start.
Yeah.
And that's the assumption. And then that's taught in another way as well through the figure of woman wisdom. So in Proverbs chapter 9, woman wisdom invites all the men, and the men are the implicit readers of the book, to come up and enjoy a meal with her that she's prepared. And in the ancient Near East, and actually even today, if you invite somebody over for a meal, you're inviting them into a relationship and to deepen a relationship. So to accept woman wisdom's invitation, you're accepting entering into a relationship with her. Now, at the end of the chapter, there's another woman called Folly who's also inviting you over for a meal. And but her meal, as he says, basically food eaten in secret is delicious. It's and the narrator tells us that if you accept her invitation, you're going to die. So of course, trying to urge you to accept woman wisdom's invitation and reject woman follies. And if you ask the question, who does woman wisdom stand for? And we'll probably come back to this question a little bit later, but I'll just start by saying, since her home is on the highest point of the city, which is where in the ancient Near East the temple would have been built, woman wisdom stands for Yahweh. And Folly, whose house is also on the highest point of the city, would stand for all the false gods and goddesses who try to lead God's people astray. So in that you carry forward that understanding that wisdom is fundamentally connected to a relationship with God. You carry forward into the so-called practical Proverbs. So you read, lazy hands are soon poor, hard workers get rich. And what you should take from that, among other things, is that if you're lazy, then you're acting like somebody who worships false gods. Where if you're a hard worker, you're acting like somebody who worships the true God.
Wow, that's awesome. Holy cow. Yeah, I've read your stuff before, but you just unpacked it so well that wisdom is inherently theological. And so is folly, and that they're both competing in the highest point. I always think of like billboards and stuff with Lady Folly, and she's calling out to you. But I didn't really think of, now I have a connection of like the Asherah pole and setting it up on all the highest points and in competition to God. And so Lady Folly is in competition.
Yes,
and come on out.
Right, for sure.
And that's theological, especially like you said in Proverbs 1:7, setting the tone for the book that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Can you explain real quick for anyone listening that says, fear sounds kind of bad? I grew up in a, evangelifish kind of church. Why do I fear God? He's supposed to be my best friend or whatever.
Well, I begin by saying this is not the type of fear that makes you run away, but this is the type of fear that you will feel when you're in the presence of somebody who is so much greater than you are. And it's the type of fear that would lead one, again, not to run away, not to hide, but the kind of fear that would lead one to pay close attention to what that person, in this case, God, said. He's the creator, you're the creature. Fear also is the type of emotion which engenders humility and keeps you from pride, which and humility is key to being a wise person, and pride is poison to it. Yeah. And so I think for all those reasons, that's why the wisdom literature puts forward fear rather than say love, which aren't contradictory with each other.
Yeah.
But it shows the importance of having a relationship with God where you understand you're the creature, he's the creator, and you will not only listen, but you will obey. So the true fear of the Lord always leads to obedience.
That's a great point. I immediately think of Aslan in Chronicles of Narnia, and he's good, but he's not safe. And one of the girls, maybe it was Lucy, I forgot who was coming to a stream and was trying to ask him to like surrender, and back off so that she could feel confident drinking. And he says, I'm not going to back off. Well, have you ever eaten a little girl? I've eaten lots of people, but he's not menacing. He's just, that's what he is. He's powerful. And there's like a holy kind of reverence going on.
Yeah, yeah, and reverence or awe might be a good other way of translating the Hebrew term. The only reason why and that's one of the issues, of course, is that languages don't line up with each other's in a way that you can easily just plug in an English word for a Hebrew term. You often have to qualify it. But because I see this close connection between what I translate fear and obedience, when I think of reverence or awe, I think of wonder. And of course, we are supposed to have reverence or awe for God, but wonder isn't a kind of emotion that at least I put together immediately with obedience. But some people, if some people find awe or reverence good term, I have no real objection to that. The old Living Bible back in the 60s, which, by the way, I'm the senior translator for the New Living Translation, which is a full translation which replaces. So I have the great privilege of working on Proverbs and the other wisdom books and the Psalms to produce that translation. The old Living Bible said respect for the Lord, and that's much too weak. So that's kind of a 60s soft pedaling.
That's great. Yeah. Well, before we go any further, Dr. Longman, what is wisdom, especially in context of Proverbs? Like, what can you help us define wisdom, proverbially from the book of Proverbs?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't have a real quick, short sentence definition. I rather like to talk about wisdom as having three aspects, and all three are essential. We already talked about the practical. We already talked about the theological, but there's also this ethical dimension that we need to be mindful of. It's Proverbs 1:3 uses three sort of central Hebrew ethical terms: yashar, which is virtuous, or some equivalent. I think it's mishpat, which is justice, and tzedakah, which is righteousness. So wisdom is connected to justice, is connected to righteousness, is connected to virtue. The wise person is also a good person. So I should come up with a handy one sentence.
That's your next book. Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
I love the three. I read a lot of John Frame, so I see threes everywhere. And
well, John Frame was my theology professor when I was in seminary.
Did you go? Were you in Philadelphia with him?
Yeah, well, yeah. So I went. I think I would have had him as a professor, 1975 to 78, and then I came back as after in 1980 as a professor at Westminster. That's where I taught for the first 18 years, and he was there for the first year, and then he went out to Westminster West in his Escondido, and then ultimately is still connected with Reformed in Orlando. But John Frame is a wonderful thinker, had a big influence on my thinking. So a lot of props to John.
Yeah, that's awesome. He listens to the podcast, which is that's insane. So yeah, he'll hear that. So we got three perspectives, as Dr. Frame would say: practical, ethical, theological. And then another thing that you drew out in the fear of the Lord is wisdom, is that you mentioned already, but EQ and IQ, and emotional intelligence and IQ, whatever that is.
Intelligent quotient. Is what
quotient. There we go. See, you're a wise man there. Does Proverbs emphasize one over the other? Or are they both at play here? Have you? Yeah, you have thought it out. I mean, I read the book, but
well, they're not totally different ideas, but when you think about IQ, you think about matters of fact. Somebody it's the type of, well, whereas wisdom is more of a skill of living, more of a, knowing how to navigate the difficulties of life, how to respond in a beneficial way when you run into the pitfalls of life. And so emotional intelligence is, well, there are other terms that are equivalent, like street smarts or social skills. And David Brooks, I don't know whether you ever see him on PBS NewsHour or anything, but he wrote a really good book called The Social Animal that talks about, he's not using biblical, even though he is a Christian, he's thought about those issues, but yeah, so that's what I have in mind. And what's interesting, I know I was delaying tactics to remember what I wanted to say. What's interesting is that studies have shown, so that, psychologists, sociologists have studied this issue, and they've shown that, somebody with a high IQ there's not a strong correlation between that and success in life, by which you mean having good, deep, rich relationships, friendships, family relationships, or getting and keeping a good job. There's just not a good correlation between that, and there is between people who have what are measured as good emotional intelligence. And so Proverbs is a book that's trying to teach the people of God how to be emotionally intelligent, and there are good benefits to that. They're not guaranteed benefits. We might talk about that later, but Proverbs tells us how to live in a way to get to a desired conclusion, all other things being equal. But before I leave this subject, for those of you with high IQs, don't despair. You can have a high IQ and also have a high emotional intelligence. But we probably all know people who are just incredibly smart, but just can't seem to function well in the world. And so again, Proverbs is a book that is trying to help people, navigate life better.
Yeah, that's helpful. Last kind of preliminary before we kind of get into the outline of the book. I love frame, and in my head I always got threes, and I see this different language, and my Hebrew is really bad. I took one semester, just the intro. So I see in the English there's wisdom, knowledge, and understanding over and over and over. And I just wanted to see, from the horse's mouth here, are those using is the author and authors of Proverbs, are they using wisdom, knowledge, and understanding in the Hebrew? Are they conveying the same point? Are those used synonymously, or are they getting at different aspects of wisdom or knowledge?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you kind of a complicated answer to that.
All right.
Which is, first of all, theoretically, they're almost certainly not saying exactly the same thing. Okay. So theoretically, they're not saying exactly the same thing because languages don't necessarily have true synonyms. It's inefficient for a language. So there's always some nuance or emphasis. Now, unfortunately, we're not ancient Hebrew speakers, so we don't capture all the nuances, but we can maybe do a little bit of speculation based, but there are some methodological dangers to doing what I'm about to say. So the word understanding is binah, and it comes from a verb banah, which means to understand, which may have more of a, it may be tending more toward the intellectual aspects of it, but and the same thing, but again, all these terms in Hebrew are not purely interested in the accumulation of facts or some kind of intellectual knowledge. They all have an experiential aspect to it. So on the one hand, I would say that, but I would see them as sort of, even if they're not purely the same word, just saying the same thing,
Right.
they are overlapping sets.
Yeah.
So
that's helpful. I want to do a deep dive on that and look back in your work as well and some of the others, because it seems like there could be like a conceptual, there could be like a practical, and then like a personal, right?
Yeah, there could be emphases there. I wouldn't make a big divide between them, but I would also say, if you want to look more into this, Michael Fox's Proverbs commentary, he it's been a while since I've looked at it, but I do remember that he does as well as anybody on that question.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. So Proverbs 23:23, I bought that book. I have that, and I just haven't looked at it yet. So that's a great tip. I'll jump into that later. So moving on to the date. I know that the dates can be tricky here. Do you have a particular date that you give to the book of Proverbs that you're set on?
No, I think virtually every biblical book has a history of composition. I don't think there are. I mean, there may be, like Nahum. I wrote my first commentary on Nahum. That might have been written at one time, but certainly not Proverbs. Now, I think Solomon is kind of the fountainhead. The historical Solomon's the fountainhead of it. But I think Solomon himself probably collected Proverbs. Proverbs are things that they're like jokes, they kind of, they kind of arise in situations. But we know that, I mean, let's even take Proverbs 25:1 as a kind of concrete example. Proverbs 25:1 says that the men of Hezekiah did something with Solomonic Proverbs. What we can say for sure about that means by the time Solomon died, Proverbs 25 and following was not in the book of Proverbs. They were brought in later, even if they are Solomonic Proverbs. So we don't have a completed book of Proverbs. And Hezekiah lives, Hezekiah is around 700 BC. Solomon's about 300 years before that. And then you have this reference to the words of the wise in chapter 23 and 24. And then you get these very kind of obscure references to Agur and Lemuel at the end of the book. So they're and it's also interesting that, say, Proverbs 1:1, Proverbs 1:10 says these are the Proverbs of Solomon, and then the next superscription said Proverbs 10:1, these are the Proverbs of Solomon. It makes one wonder whether some of the material in 1 through 9 was added later. But again, these are interesting questions, but they're highly speculative, and they make no difference to the meaning of the book, because whether or not a book has a history of composition, what's canon to us is the final form of the book.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so the Holy Spirit not only has inspired the original, like whoever wrote them, but also the compilers and down to the final form. Yeah, that's
exactly. There are a lot of anonymous books in the Old Testament that we don't know who the authors was. So there are also probably a lot of anonymous later authors whose material, through the inspiration of the Spirit, are brought into the.
Well, I think that's you just helped me think of that more about Proverbs, because proverbial statements are passed down from father to son to grandmother said this, and if it's true, it rings true throughout multiple generations. So doesn't mean that Solomon had to have them all divinely planted in his head, but that he's getting some from David, who got it from his father, who heard it from him, and maybe all the way
Yeah.
back. Yeah,
Well, and also,
that's
I mean,
cool.
it's interesting that some of the proverbs seem to come from the royal court. Like there's a proverb that says, "When you're eating with the king, put a knife to your throat." It's kind of like, well, obviously, only a few people eat with the king anyway. Now you can, that has broader application, but it probably emanates from the court. Whereas you also have proverbs like a son who does not harvest. That seems to come from an agrarian or more folk background. So it seems from the nature of the proverbs themselves that they come from even different, what we would call social location.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's really good. I think about, there's like a lizard in the king's palace. And it's like, well, how would I know that if I'm an agrarian? Yeah,
Right.
that's a great point.
And then the other thing is there are some proverbs, they're hard to notice that this is the case, but there are some proverbs that are repeated verbatim twice in different parts of the book.
Yeah.
Or there are some that are 3 and even some that are 4 times repeated, which may be evidence that, proverbs were added by groups and they didn't edit out duplicates.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. So I'm interested in date, at least insofar as like when Solomon lived and stuff, because for me, I got a little bit of a chip on my shoulder because I think I like Plato, I like Aristotle, I like reading those guys. I really like philosophy. But thinking about Plato and his position in Western history and philosophy, in particular, but history in general, and he's talking about philosopher kings and all this stuff. And Solomon's like 500 years before him, and he was the philosopher king.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it is, Parker, and again, I think that it's pretty clear, at least in my reading of Proverbs, that Solomon is the fountainhead. So whether there were later Proverbs that were added under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, still your point is right.
Yeah, so I like that. I'm like, let's go back to Proverbs. Let's see what divine wisdom says here. And then another thing, a chip is the book of Job reads like a proto Platonic dialogue on justice or theodicy, or and it's all these characters going back and forth. But what Plato did with Socrates' his mouthpiece, God did in time and space through this book. I think it's so fantastic, but I want to bring that to the fore because people are enamored with Plato. Dude, that's great, but the Bible's here too. Like, check this stuff out.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's good. That's good.
Well, so another thing, I think of the Psalms, and they're probably singing these Psalms. They're being read or sung. How are people? What's the intended audience for Proverbs? Are they reading these in temple? What's going on with that?
Yeah, that's the $64,000 question, as they say. So first of all, I mean, you can tell from the preface, Proverbs 1 through 7, it functions kind of like a preface of a book.
Yeah.
And it first of all says that these Proverbs are for the immature, which is the way I prefer to translate petit, which is simple-minded, the young and immature. And then you see too, of course, the dynamic of Proverbs 1 through 9, that a father speaking to his son or sons. But interestingly, going back to that preface, it goes on to say, and let the wise read them and be even wiser.
Yeah.
So this book isn't just for young, immature men. It's for everybody, because everybody can grow in wisdom. Everybody can grow in wisdom. Wisdom's not like a PhD, once I had my PhD, I'm Dr. Longman. Even if I would, heaven forbid, have a stroke tonight and couldn't speak, I'd still be Dr. Longman.
Yeah.
And that has to do with more IQ than EQ. Whereas with wisdom, you can grow in wisdom. And indeed, I think the book of Job, Job's fears God at the beginning. He's wise at the beginning, but he's even wiser at the end.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And you can lose wisdom, as Solomon indicates. So So wisdom is something that always needs to be nurtured and fed. But now your question also raises the issue of social location again. I mean, it's possible that Proverbs functioned within a school-like setting, though we don't have any explicit evidence of schools as such until the post-Old Testament period, the intertestamental time period. So you have to be a little careful about insisting on that. But other neighboring cultures, like in ancient Sumer and Babylon, we know that, and in Egypt, these types of texts function in a school setting as well.
Okay.
So, but I do think we have, but it's probably more likely that it function within a family setting.
Okay.
So unfortunately, we're mostly speculating when we get to the issue of social location.
Yeah. Well, that's really helpful. That's another one that's just opening up a lot of doors for me. But again, got to be careful not to over absolutize or speculate there. So I thought maybe we could just run through briefly. I know like this is hours and weeks and years of your life's work, but just kind of giving a brief overview for folks at home. I'm planning to do a whole series on 30 episodes on Proverbs.
Oh, great.
So we'll be going into this in more depth, but just kind of an overview from your work. So 1 through 7 is a preamble or prelude, what you said, and can you just help us? I use this language; it wasn't yours, so feel free to correct it. But I see it as like setting the hermeneutic of how we're supposed to read Proverbs. This anthology of wisdom. It's setting the tone. It's fixing your gaze. Is that correct? Do you think that's right?
Yeah, no, I do think that's right. Yeah, I think both the preface and then Proverbs 1 through 9 as a whole kind of functions as what I call a hermeneutical lens to read Proverbs.
Okay.
And following as well. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the lens where Lady Wisdom is brought in.
Yeah, that's right. And so and in those first 9 chapters, you have little speeches or discourses or lectures. You don't you have the occasional proverb. Proverb defined as a short, pithy, memorable observation, admonition, usually just one verse or maybe a couple verses. But in 1 through 9, you have these lengthier speeches where a father's talking to his son, or woman wisdom is talking to all the men who go by.
Yeah. Okay, and there's an emphasis that I've caught through Proverbs of, if you're wise, you'll listen to your elders. You'll listen to your father. You'll listen to Lady Wisdom. She knows better than you. And then going all the way to the end there, with King Lemuel, he's listening to his mother.
Yeah.
So it's actually being practiced out. So like taking intergenerational wisdom and applying it to your life because they've lived longer than you. And so I can have this accumulation of my father's wisdom and my own wisdom.
Right.
And so don't have to relearn their lessons the hard way.
Exactly. And of course that presupposes that your father is wise himself, which isn't always the case. I mean, but the assumption is an older person has more wisdom than the younger person because they've had more experiences, they've observed, they've reflected, they've learned from their mistakes.
Yeah.
And so again, that's kind of the default. But there are, I mean, the 3 friends of Job are a good example of older men who aren't wise in this situation, and who
that's a great point.
need to be rejected.
Yeah. So in this section that we're talking about, you have Lady Wisdom calling, and this has been what I accidentally found was a source of controversy in different evangelical circles and stuff. But that Lady Wisdom as a metaphor for Christ or an analogy, or wisdom personified. How should we think about Lady Wisdom and Christ?
Sure. So let's first of all stay within the Old Testament, and then we'll go to the New Testament.
That's
So
great.
as we read it in the Old Testament, to repeat myself a bit, woman wisdom is a personification of Yahweh's wisdom, and ultimately stands for God himself.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's a personification, treating an abstract or inanimate object as a person.
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of metaphor. So yeah, you're right. It is a metaphor of God and his wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we turn to the New Testament, we see in various places where Jesus is being associated with woman wisdom. And I'll come back to this word associate rather than identify. That in Matthew 11, Jesus says to his Jewish disputants, he says, but wisdom will be proved right by her actions,
Mm-hmm.
which is a reference to his actions. In Colossians 1:15, Jesus is the image of God. He's the firstborn of creation, which is a reference to Proverbs 8 and woman wisdom being the firstborn of creation.
Yeah.
And the language of John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. The Word was with God, is a also, of course, looking more directly to Genesis 1, but also having intimations of Proverbs 8. And then finally, there's a passage in Revelation 3. I forget the exact verse where Jesus is called Jesus is identified as, I think, the ruler of God's creation, which is a Greek translation of Proverbs 8:30, a rare word, amon, which sometimes is translated nursling, but should probably be translated something like craftsperson. So Jesus, the New Testament associates Jesus with woman wisdom, whom Larry said represents God's wisdom and ultimately God himself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the reason why I don't say identify is because Proverbs 8 is not a prophecy of Jesus.
Yeah.
It's really, by associating Jesus with woman wisdom, it's a way of saying Jesus is the very epitome of God's wisdom.
Yeah.
And the reason why you have to avoid the idea of identification, and you always have to remember that this is poetic language,
right,
is because if you start treating it as non-poetic language or as prophecy or a description of Jesus, then you're going to end up a Jehovah Witness.
Right. Yeah, Jesus was created. Yeah, the Son was
literally the firstborn of creation. That's a metaphor that just is a way of associating him.
Yeah, as the preeminent one, not the literally born in temporal meaning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, I really like that. Some people will point back to Lady Wisdom, especially in Proverbs 8, and talk about a diversity in the Godhead, or at least opening up, the seeds of that are then more fully revealed in Christ. Is there anything there? Would Jews have caught that, or not really?
They would not have caught that.
Okay.
And I also don't think that is a legitimate way of reading Proverbs 8. So
that's helpful. Yeah. Oh, I think that's super direct. Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. That's not my view, but I've heard people say that.
Oh no, right. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and we have to be mindful of those types of well-intentioned but wrong-minded uses of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
That if you're evangelizing a Jewish person, they'll go to their rabbi and they'll ask him, and they'll say, no, it never would have been read that way in the Old Testament time period, and they would be right about that.
Yeah, there's other places to go.
Yeah.
Than Proverbs 8.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. That's really going to be helpful for my listeners, I'm sure. So then we move on to Solomonic Proverbs, Proverbs 10, 1 through 22, 16. all the way to what was it, 29, 27, I think. That's like the Solomonic Proverbs. Then you have sayings of the wise, 22:17 through 24:34.
Yeah.
Are the sayings of the wise? I know we talked about compilation already, but are do we know, are these sayings of the wise that Solomon picked up and said, I've learned these things, I'm going to put them in here, or is that, we don't know?
We don't know.
Okay.
For sure. It could have been that. It could have been that this is a section that was added later. What we do know is that the Proverbs in this section bear a higher degree of similarity with Egyptian Proverbs than other parts, even though other parts do too. By the way, I did another Proverbs commentary in John Walton's Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Dictionary.
Okay.
And the whole purpose of that commentary is to talk about the connections with the ancient Near East. So, so there's a particularly close connection with one Egyptian instruction, which is called the Instructions of Amenemope, that are older than Solomon, and there are 30 chapters in this Instruction of Amenemope, and then, as you know, the words of the wise are introduced as having 30 sayings in them. So a lot of scholars see that here's an example where the Israelite sages, whether it's Solomon or others, are learning from Egyptian wisdom.
Wow, yeah, that's great. That's like, I guess Augustine says we can plunder the Egyptians, right?
Yeah,
And they literally were. Yeah.
What other theologians call common grace.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So, so we got sayings of the wise. Then we get to Proverbs 30 and the sayings of is it Agur?
I always say Agur.
That sounds good. I like that. Sayings of Agur. Yeah.
Yeah.
How are these sayings different than the sayings of the wise, or how do they compare with the rest of the Proverbs?
Well, let's see here. Yeah, I mean, they're for one thing, they're harder to translate to interpret, but and they also are not similar to what I've been describing as these short kind of 2-line proverbs. But in other ways, I mean, they are wisdom. They are advice that's being imparted to the audience. We don't know who Agur and Lemuel are. Some people try to argue that they're other names for Solomon, but
I've always heard growing up in church saying, "Oh no, it's Solomon." It's like, well, it doesn't say that. I don't get where you get that from.
We have no evidence that that's the case, and I think that arises from people who want to insist that Solomon wrote the whole book.
Okay.
Which some people think is necessary to assure its divine authority, and I don't. I, as we talked about earlier, God uses a variety of human authors, number of whose names we know, and a number of them we don't know. We don't know who wrote the book of Joshua or Judges or Chronicles. We don't know who wrote a lot of the Psalms that aren't ascribed to an author, or who the sons of Korah are, really.
Right. Well, I've heard that might be a characteristic that distinguishes Christians, or at least evangelical Christians, from Jewish readers, who I think Jewish readers wanted to make sure everyone was associated with a prophet or with the author that they knew. Is that a fair characterization, or not really?
I'm not sure. Well, it's certainly not true of every Jewish person, and it is. I mean, there are some Christians who get very nervous if you can't associate it with. But what is true is that within Jewish thinking, there is this tendency to associate even anonymous writings with a particular personage, but it's based on no historical evidence. It's like eventually, by the time you come to so virtually every psalm eventually gets ascribed to David, for instance.
Okay.
So, but again, that's just even though within the Hebrew Bible itself, only 74 of the 150 are ascribed to David.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. And then finishing up, we have Proverbs 31, 10 through 31, and this one will be really famous to a lot of the ladies listening. And it's about the wise woman. Well, it's not all about that, but yeah, it's about the Proverbs 31 woman.
Yeah,
Actually,
yeah.
that's what it said. So it I've I've always thought this is as a man, a young man, this is what I want my wife to be like. This is what I'm going to pray for my future wife. And then come to seminary, and one of my professors said, this it's about women, but it's also something that men can be appropriating as well. And I was confused by that, and I'm not sure. Do you have any thoughts? Is this poem here at the end of Proverbs, is this wisdom for women, or is this wisdom for both men and women? How do we look at this, I guess, from both genders?
Well, there's no question but that within its Old Testament setting, the whole book is primarily addressed to men. But that doesn't, and particularly young men, but that doesn't mean that women can't read it, for instance. And I think one person told me the term is mutatis mutandi. Start thinking about using the same teaching to think through what a virtuous man is. Or you take the earlier Proverbs that say better to live in the corner of an attic than in the house with an irritating woman. If you're a woman reader, you should just substitute man for a woman.
Yeah.
But I will also say that Psalm 112 actually helps a lot, because it takes a lot of the characteristics that are being ascribed to the virtuous woman and are ascribing them to a man, Psalm 112. So if you look at Psalm 112, you'll see that that a lot of the qualities of the virtuous woman are there very explicitly said to be the qualities of a virtuous man. And Psalm 111 is a poem talking about God's wonderful attributes, which are then being applied in Psalm 112 to the man.
Okay.
So I've written a series of books with a psychologist friend. We've been close friends for 50 years, named Dan Allender. And Dan and I wrote a book called Intimate Allies, where we address this question. Intimate Allies is a book about marriage. So we talk about Proverbs 31 in this way, and then we bring in Psalm 112 and Psalm 111. So yeah, that's how I think about it.
Yeah.
I also think that I think it says, "Who can find such a woman?" And you probably can't. I mean, or who could find such a man? You can't. I mean, I think it's taking all the attributes of wisdom. I mean, there's so much we could say about this in terms of what it frees women up to do, particularly in a patriarchal society.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And but on the other hand, through my teaching over the years, I know that some women love it and find it freeing, and some women find it oppressive and difficult. And I think one of the things is that that they're qualities we all should aspire to: generosity to the poor, hardworking to help our families out.
Skilled at what we do.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a great point. So as we finish up here, you talk about two pitfalls that should be avoided when we go about thinking about the Proverbs. One is absolutizing the Proverbs, and two is isolating the Proverbs. Now, I think you wrote this book a long time ago, so I'm asking you to kind of recall a lot of this. Is that still fresh? Do you still know what you meant by that?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, cool.
So we don't want to absolutize Proverbs, because getting back to what I mentioned at the front is Proverbs as a genre aren't universal truths. They're only true when applied in the right situation.
Right.
To be a wise person means you need to know more than the Proverbs. You have to learn how to read situations and how to read people. So you have Proverbs 26 verses 4 and 5. Don't answer a fool according to his folly. followed immediately by answer a fool according to his folly.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see, you have to, when you get into a situation with somebody that you believe is foolish and what they're arguing or saying or doing, you then have to analyze the situation. Will it help or hurt for me to interact with this person? Are there other people around who might benefit from my interacting with this person?
Yeah.
And on and on. So I mean, there are some proverbs that are always true. I mean, like, don't sleep with an immoral woman who's not your wife, those types of proverbs. But you know that because we know that not because of the proverb, but because of the seventh commandment, which it's reflecting. And so that's the first thing I would say. And then the second thing I would say is, my former colleague and good friend, Bruce Walke, puts it this way. Proverbs don't make promises, don't treat Proverbs as promises. Lazy hands are soon poor, hard workers get rich. That doesn't guarantee that if you work hard, you'll get rich but for 99% of people, if you're lazy, you're going to get fired and you're going to struggle. But then you have the Paris Hiltons of the world who inherit a lot of money.
That's right.
Who can be. Yeah. So those are some thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So as we bring it to a close here, Solomon wrote, he's the fountainhead of this. He turned out to be kind of a fool at the end of his life. Can you just explain how a man who could be so wise became so foolish?
Well, I mean, 1 Kings 11 tells us because he fell in love with pagan women. He did exactly what he warned against in Proverbs 5-7, and he let them lure him into the worship of false gods. And it's a reminder that even the wisest person can lose their wisdom and become fools. And so we should always be mindful of guarding our hearts and our minds.
Yeah. What a tragic story, but so true, so good. Like it's right there in Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And it repeats over and over. And he didn't do it. He stopped doing it. And so that's always a reminder to me as well. Like, he was wiser than I'll ever be. But if he could fall, then so could I. Yeah. So I better just keep following Lady Wisdom, keep following the path, keep following Christ. He's the path, he is the way, he is the true a source of wisdom and salvation and life. Yeah.
Right. Amen to that.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Longman, thank you so much for all your time. This has been so helpful, and it's really set up the whole series that Lord willing I'll be able to do. And I'm still looking to get in contact with Bruce Walke as well.
Okay.
But yeah, to have some more scholars on to help me with this series as we preempt the Jordan Peterson series, and hopefully bring a lot of good teaching to people who need wisdom, just like we do.
Great. Yeah. Amen, Parker.
Well, awesome. This has been Parker's Pensies. We'll talk about this some more in the future, but for now, it's going to have to do it. And as always, all glory to God.